Baelor the Blessed, arguably the most unique Targaryen king in history, yet simultaneously one of the most familiar, because George R. R. Martin intentionally wanted him to give off Jesus vibes. He straight up told Amok, the first artist to draw him, to use Jesus as the inspiration. Baelor walked through the desert, was a man of peace and humility, shunned both wealth and pleasure. He didn't die from something that really should have killed him, though at the time it didn't look like he'd make it. So, he was on death's door but survived miraculously, basically. That's kind of like resurrection, right? There's a lot to like about all that, especially given sitting the Iron Throne tends to be an extremely violent job with lots of deaths chalked up. And that was still true of Baelor's reign, though definitely far less than other reigns, as far as we can tell. It's no wonder the Commons remember him so fondly, though, and why it was such a sin to execute Lord Eddard Stark at the sept named for him, that he himself commissioned, we might add. But Baelor was not without his faults. As dedicated as he was to peace, he was quite possibly a member of the Mad Targaryens Club, or someone who joined it later in life. He's a reminder that you don't have to be violent to be insane. He may have had dreams, like the occasional Targaryen does. And how does a mind such as his interpret such? Probably as the word of the gods, really, but the seven in his case, of course, not the Valyrian gods of old. The dragons were gone or going during his lifetime, and his brother tried to conquer like one. Baelor turned that around, wanting peace and forgiveness from the Dornish, but he did at least one thing like a dragon, burning vast amounts of knowledge. Oh, hey, don't do that. He may have saved many in the short term, only to doom many more in the long term by casting them out of the light that shines through education. He did harm in other non-violent ways as well, to women, to policy, to communication, to worship of the old gods. A fascinating guy, really, a man of extremes. So this most unique of Targaryen kings gives us a lot to discuss, and we will, not to mention historical parallels aplenty, because we love those too. And with us today is a guest, one very familiar around these parts, unless you're new here. All that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of History of Westeros podcast. This is an episode on Baelor the Blessed, mostly but not entirely scripted, and does have spoilers for House of the Dragon, just in case you're trying to avoid that. And with us to discuss is our longtime friend, co-writer, and contributor, Nina. How's it going, Nina? Writer of goodqueenalley.tumblr.com. So glad to have you here. How's it going?
Yes, I am super excited to be back. I feel like it has been approximately 10 billion years since I have been on. So I am really excited, and I have been trying to get an episode done about Baelor for quite a while now, so it's good to finally get this done.
Yeah, right. Either way, we've got a lot of content for you. So let's start off with initial impressions. During the intro, I basically kind of gave mine. Nina, what about yours? Give us your overview of Baelor the Blessed.
I have wanted to talk about Baelor, like I said, for a very long time, because to me, Baelor is such an interesting character, and he's interesting because, as you say, he is a character of extremes. And I say extremes plural there, because there are aspects to Baelor's personality that when we read them, as readers, they can come across as polarized and sometimes even contrasting. And so it's our job as readers to really wrestle with those, to think about them, to analyze them, so that we can come to a conclusion. Whether or not we say at the end of the day, I like Baelor or I hate Baelor, we can come to a conclusion about his character at the end of the day by wrestling with these extremes of his personality. So, we take, for example, if we ask the question, what is Baelor's attitude toward war? Well, on the one hand, we've got the Baelor who is so committed to peace with Dorne that he literally puts his body on the line to get it. And that's a commitment to peace, and especially a peace in a conflict that had, at least off and on, obsessed the Targaryen monarchy for 150 years, that we really don't see equaled anywhere else. I would say even Daeron II doesn't go quite so far. And yet, do we stop there? Do we say, oh, well, Baelor's a man of peace then, right? Well, not exactly, because at the end of his reign, he seems perfectly willing to go to war against his own people on the basis of religion. So, again, when we ask this question, what's Baelor's attitude toward war, it's not a simple answer. There are layers to it. And it's the same thing for, to take another example, what's Baelor's attitude toward the small folk? Again, on the one hand, We've got the Baelor who is so committed to charity toward the small folk that he is literally emptying the royal treasury to put resources directly in the hands of the people. And again, that's huge. That's a commitment to charity, especially in a deeply classist world like Westeros, that we very, very, very rarely, if ever, see equaled. And yet, do we stop there? Do we say, oh, well, Baelor's the benefactor of his people then, right? Well, again, not exactly, because this is the same Baelor who is perfectly willing to throw 1,000 women and children out of what, for many of them, is probably the only home they've ever known, with probably nothing more than the clothes on their back because they are sex workers or the children of sex workers. So again, when we ask the question, what's Baelor's attitude toward the small folk? Not a simple answer, something that does have layers to it. And so again, when we think about Baelor as a character, I think there's a lot of complexity to him, and it comes from these extremes in his personality.
Well said. Yeah, extremes are at the heart of Baelor's character, and savvy listeners know that extremes are unsustainable. We've gone over enough leaders, monarchs, rulers to see how that tends to burn itself out. His extreme devotion to peace was laudable, but yeah, some of his ideas might have actually led to war. It might not have been his top priority. It seems like his interpretation of the faith might have been. And just consider that it was Viserys I's reign that set up the Dance of the Dragons. He wasn't warlike at all either, right? But nevertheless, his version of peace arguably only made war all the more inevitable. Because if there's one thing Baelor was even more devoted to, yeah, it was the seven. I guess for Viserys, what was it? Parties, wine, I don't know. But still, it wasn't actually peace. Peace was a byproduct, I suppose. And it wasn't just a goal for the future, Baelor's case. He was trying to atone for the past. It's like he had a burden of guilt for both the beliefs and actions of his ancestors. In a very conflicting and confusing way, though, often completely at odds with itself. And this massive weight, in turn, fuels more extremes, which in turn makes him even more interesting.
I'd absolutely agree. And the other thing that I wanted to mention, and part of the reason that I want to talk about Baelor, and it's a bit related to the point I was making before, is I want to, at least to some extent, to challenge our expectations. The expectations that we encounter in universe about Baelor, and also those that we as readers may have about him. We encounter a number of characters in the main novels and in the Tales of Dunk and Egg who think of Baelor as weak or befuddled or incapable of ruling or just uninterested in ruling. And I think for us as readers, it can be easy to simply take those evaluations at face value. To say, Baelor was more septon than king, he really wasn't interested in being king, he decided to pray for 10 years while his uncle ruled the realm. And I don't want to suggest that nothing is true about that, of course. But what I want to do is ask ourselves, is that everything to Baelor? Or are we looking at someone who, if we start really peeling away the context of Baelor, really starting to look at that, do we see someone who is perhaps both more and less familiar than these evaluations that we encounter in the main novels and in the Tales of Dunk and Egg might suggest? So, I think it's important to always remember Baelor is Aegon III's son. And I think you do see a lot of Aegon III in Baelor. Baelor is the first in the generation of Targaryens who are born after the dance. And I do think you see the shadow of the dance that hangs over a lot of his life and reign. Baelor is absolutely pious, no question about it, but he's not the only pious Targaryen in his generation. And that's something I want to focus on, that generational aspect to Targaryen piety at this time. And ultimately, what I want to suggest is, again, whether or not you consider Baelor a good or bad king, completely separate question. But what I ultimately want to show is that I don't think we can call Baelor a weak king. I think Baelor was someone who had a very clear idea of why he was king, why he was intended to be king, what he wanted to accomplish as king, and was not shy about telling anyone and everyone what he wanted done and how he expected to see it done.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to frame it around Aegon III quite a bit. This is a man who wore a hair shirt because, that's something you do when you feel guilty either for yourself or your family. And it seems like Baelor took that idea and boosted it, took it to another level. I mean, this guy walked from King's Landing to Dorne. And that not only shows his devotion, but it reminds us what you were just saying. That's not something a weak person can do. Like, they wouldn't even dream of doing it, let alone actually doing it. And it was barefoot. So, like, yeah, that's not weak. It might have been crazy, but it wasn't weak. And he might have had physical frailties. Well, he did have physical frailties, but a lot of those were self-inflicted. His own will pushed him into those extremes, which takes a certain amount of strength, extreme strength. So a lot of that physical weakness was just because of his own personality. He wore himself down, we'll say, and it may have been what killed him. We have our doubts to that, but that discussion is yet to come. So let's start at the start, first with the first mention, then the start of his life.
I find this fascinating because Baelor gets his first mention so incredibly early in the series. I mean, we're talking Eddard II, A Game of Thrones. That is the 4th or 5th chapter in the entire series, depending on whether or not you count the prologue.
Gods have mercy, you scarcely knew Catelyn.
I had taken her to wife. She was carrying my child.
You're too hard on yourself, Ned. You always were. Damn it, no woman wants Baelor the Blessed in her bed. He slapped a hand on his knee. Well, I'll not press you if you feel so strong about it, though I swear at times you're so prickly you ought to take the hedgehog as your sigil.
So again, I do find this so fascinating that Baelor gets this mentioned so incredibly early. Because I think it speaks to just how interested the author was in Baelor as a character. You know, we don't know at this point. Certainly we know that George R. Martin had an interest in the Targaryens from the first time that he's writing A Game of Thrones, because he includes that list of Targaryen kings at the very end in the appendix. So we know he's interested in the Targaryens generally, and obviously it won't be too long until he starts writing the Tales of Dunk and Egg to get more into the history side. But this is still so early in writing A Song of Ice and Fire. He's still so early in establishing the world building, and we don't know to what extent he was developing the personalities of various Targaryen monarchs. And yet here, in the 4th or 5th chapter of the entire series, George R. Martin has clearly already started thinking about Baelor's personality. He's already describing Baelor as Baelor the Blessed, very explicitly in universe, connecting him to not only a very pious attitude, but this almost puritanical attitude towards sex. And so again, I think that just speaks to how interested George R. R. Martin was in Baelor as a character. And to be fair, obviously, Baelor Seth is a very important location in A Game of Thrones, so it does make sense in a narrative way why he's describing Baelor so early. But on a more general level, I think George R. R. Martin may simply have just been really interested in developing Baelor as a character at this point, in a way he might not have been even for other Targaryen characters.
As for his appearance that we talked about briefly during the intro, here's the full quote directly from George himself to Amok, the artist.
Baelor the Blessed, Baelor the Beloved, the Septon King. No sword or armor here, only a Septon's white robes tied off with a rope belt. A young man in his early 20s, but very thin, from repeated fasts and frail-looking, with a gentle, almost beatific smile. Think Jesus. One hand raised in blessing, the other holding a holy book, black leather, with a 7-pointed star stamped on the cover in gold leaf. His long hair and beard remind one of Jesus too, although Baelor's are the typical Targaryen silver-gold color. Wears a crown of flowers and vines.
Of course, that's him as an adult, and after his walk, he only lived to be age 27. This, of course, says early 20s, so we're not quite to the end after he had maybe done some starving of himself. He did a lot of fasting, and he probably would have looked more gaunt or something like that, huh, Nina?
I would absolutely agree. And I think that, you know, and by all means, this is a fantastic picture of Baelor. So in no way, all credit to the artist here, and you know, all credit to George R. Martin for giving this great description of him. So in no way do I want to denigrate the picture. But I think that it's a bit of a misleading picture, fundamentally because it has to be. Because can only capture this certain aspect of Baelor, and perhaps Baelor as he wanted to be seen. You know, this is Baelor who is physically weak, but apparently very blissful in his own piety. And while I certainly don't want to say that wasn't true about Baelor, I think that absolutely was true about him. Again, I think there's a side to Baelor that no picture of him could probably truly capture. This is a man who, yes, he has this appearance of, this sort of blissful piety, this sort of physical weakness, but underneath it, there's an iron will there. And I think Baelor was not shy about, pursuing what he believed to do what was right.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. So this gives us a bit of idea what he's going to be, the picture of a man he was when it was all said and done. So let's go all the way back to his birth. He was born in 144, King's Landing, 13 years after the Dance of the Dragons. The dragons hadn't fully died out yet, but the last one would die when he was only 9 years old, so pretty early on. He was the second son and second child of Aegon III Targaryen and Queen Daenerys Velaryon. Aegon III himself, of course, is the elder son of Rhaenyra and Daemon. Let's not forget that. Now, by the time Baelor was born, Aegon III's been king for around 13 years. Remember that Aegon became king himself pretty early, at age 11, and had a 5-year regency at the beginning of his reign. So Baelor was born right in the middle of Aegon's reign. So he would rule for another 13 years, 26 total. And this was, right smack dab in the middle. His mother, Daenerys, though, is Aegon III's second wife. Remember, Aegon and Daenerys, at this point, were married for 11 years. And Daenerys is only about 17 when Baelor was born. Baelor was the second in a quick succession of 5 children for the king and queen. Daeron was born a year earlier in 143. That's Daeron the Young Dragon. And sisters Daena, Rhaena, and Elena, nice rhyming there, were born in 145, 147, and 150. So, like we said, all 5 of them were born between 143 and 150. So Baelor became second in line for the throne at the moment of his birth, and would have been so for the entirety of his father's reign. Now, we've seen a lot of famous second sons. It's a major social distinction in Westeros amongst noble families. Doesn't matter quite so much amongst commoners, but hey. Prince Daemon himself was the second son, as we know famously, as well as his mirror image, Prince Aemond, right? Tyrion, second son, not just by birth, but currently a member of the sellsword company by the same name, right? Baelor's contemporary, Aemon the Dragon Knight, was a second son, a famous one, an inspiration, a living legend. Ned Stark was a second son, right? Baelor had things in common with all of these characters, but in many ways, he was an outlier. He didn't exist in his brother's shadow in the, shall we say, normal way, right? He wasn't overshadowed. He was just different. He was completely different. Like, he changed the paradigm, not just from his brother, but from most Targaryens, if not most people, period. Just a really different guy all around, huh?
Absolutely, absolutely. And obviously, no one knows this at the time of Baelor's birth. They're only seeing a new baby son is born to the king and queen. And so as they're seeing this birth, as Baelor's birth is announced to the realm and all the ravens are going out, I think what most Westerosi are probably experiencing is this sense of relief. Again, I mentioned this just a moment ago, but it's always worth repeating. Baelor is in the first generation of Targaryens who are born after the dance. And we can never overemphasize just how devastating the dance was. Not obviously just to the realm, although it very much was, but also to the Targaryens as a dynasty. There are, I think, around 9 Targaryens who died during the dance. And that's not even counting Rhaenyra's 3 Valyrian sons or Prince Viserys, who is believed to be dead at the end of the dance, although he does eventually obviously come back. And when the dance is all said and done, there are only 4 Targaryens left and only one boy. That's Aegon III. And there's a real concern during Aegon's regency of what's going to happen if Aegon dies without an heir. Who does the crown go to? This is a completely unprecedented situation. Now, granted, that was a little bit alleviated with the return of Prince Viserys. But as Aegon starts to have children of his own, especially as he starts to have sons of his own, I think you get this sense of relief, or there probably would have been this sense of relief throughout the realm that the Targaryen dynasty is returning to, as much as we can use the term for a royal dynasty and for the Targaryens in particular, a sense of normalcy. Now, not only do we have an heir, that's Daeron, but we've also got the spare Baelor, so that 7 forbid, anything should happen to Daeron, we've still got Baelor to inherit. That male line from Aegon III can still continue. And so that's, I think, what would have been sort of the main reaction to Baelor's birth.
Right on. Now, let's remind ourselves as well of why he was named the way he was. Naming is important amongst Targaryens. It tells us things, and Baelor is kind of interesting in that regard. Now, Daeron, of course, that was his elder brother. That's one of the most familiar Targaryen names, maybe the second most familiar after Aegon. His eldest sister, Daena, first Daena that we know of, but the DAE prefix for Targaryen women and men is super common. Daeron, Daemon, Damian, Daenys, Daenerys, Daenora, Daella, Daerissa, and Daenara, their mother, right? So that's pretty common, I guess. Baelor's other two sisters were Rhaena, a name we see several times with variants like Rhaenys or Rhaenyra, Rhaella, Rhael, Rhae, Rhaegar, Rhaegil, Rhaego, if you want to count that one, Daenerys' baby with Drogo. And then Elena, a name less common, but definitely seen before. One of the pre-conquest Targaryens was named Elena. That was the daughter of Daenys the Dreamer herself and, husband Gaemon the Glorious, who was also pretty important given his name. But Baelor is the first Baelor. There's a few slightly similar names, like Balon, I guess. What do you think, Nina?
Well, so it is always worth pointing out, obviously, whenever we're talking about names, it's not necessarily the case that Baelor was named after someone specific. The author is far from consistent when it comes to identifying specific in-universe namesakes for characters, and that's completely fine. We don't read the series because of that. But if Baelor was named after someone specific, if Aegon III had a specific namesake or specific namesakes in mind for baby Baelor, then I think there are two really likely possibilities. And that's Prince Baelon Targaryen and Princess Baela Targaryen.
Right on. Okay, well, why those two? Why Baelon and maybe Baela? What's the connection there exactly? Besides sounding similar, of course.
Well, I think for Baelon, on the one hand, there's a very obvious family connection, right? Because Baelon is not only the king's paternal grandfather, he's also the king's maternal great-grandfather, because Baelon is the father of Viserys I and Daemon. So when Viserys I's daughter Rhaenyra marries Daemon and has Aegon III, Baelon becomes this double ancestor of Aegon III and all of his future children. And so on a very basic family level, Aegon III may have said, very easy namesake to choose. This is a double ancestor of mine. We're just going to go with that for my second son. But I'd also like to think about, is it possible that Aegon III was thinking about the name Baelor in honor of Baelon as a way to show what he wanted, not only for the future of the realm, but also for the future of the Targaryen dynasty? We know, obviously, that Aegon III spends pretty much the entirety of his adult reign trying to rebuild the realm, trying to restore this sense of peace and justice and stability after the chaos and destruction of the dance, and to no small extent, the Regency as well.
So Aegon III was a big influence on him. Obviously, not only was that his father, but he was the only king he had as a model. But during his life, that is. What about in general, though? Who was the ideal model, would you say, for Baelor?
Well, I think the answer, and certainly at the very least for Aegon III as well, the model of Targaryen kingship is almost certainly Jaehaerys I. Now, when I say this, to be clear, I have a lot of thoughts about Jaehaerys I, and very few of them are kind. But I think it's fair to say that the popular imagination of Jaehaerys I throughout Westeros is the ideal Targaryen monarch, the king who rules over this golden age for House Targaryen, at a time when the land is generally at peace, when there is generally prosperity, and when the Targaryen dynasty itself seems secure and stable and strong. And who's a key figure of this era? It's Prince Baelon. He's Baelon the Brave. He's the war hero. He's the loyal lieutenant. He's the capable hand. He's everything you want in a Targaryen prince, and especially in the king's second surviving son. And so as Aegon III is thinking about who to name his own second son after, I could see where the king may have looked to Baelon to say, I'm making this connection between my own reign and the reign of Jaehaerys I. In other words, my Baelor is the new Balon. Just as Balon was the strong and capable and loyal second son who helped this golden age under Jaehaerys I, my Baelor is going to be the strong and capable and loyal second son who's going to usher in a second golden age for House Targaryen.
Now, what about the idea that it's Baela? We talked about Balon, and that's very convincing, very possible, but we mentioned Baela. So what's the angle there, do you think?
Well, I think, and of course it's worth noting, of course, Baela was herself named after Prince Balon. So there is that connection there as well. But as far as Baela goes as a possible namesake for Baelor, it's no exaggeration, I think, to say that without Baela, Baelor, or at least this version of Baelor, simply doesn't exist. Because it's Baela who, along with her sister Rhaena, brings Daenerys Valerian to Aegon III to present to him when all of the eligible women of Westeros and some of Essos are being brought in what becomes known as the Maiden's Day Cattle Show. And Aegon seems to have had a pretty good relationship with both Baela and her eventual husband, Alan Valerian. And so I could see where Aegon, who, again, suffered so much in his childhood, lost so many members of his family, may have wanted to honor his sister, one of the very, very few family members left to him after the dance, by naming one of his children after her, by saying, I recognize that you are family and you are some of the only family I have left. And I appreciate you, essentially giving me my wife. So I'm going to name my son after you. And for whatever it's worth, he does end up naming, as you say, his second daughter, Rhaena. And what's Baela's twin's name? Also Rhaena. So it's very possible that both Baelor and Rhaena were named after Baela and Rhaena.
That makes a lot of sense, y'all. If you have forgotten, not only did Baela and Rhaena present Daenerys Valerian, who wins the so-called Maiden's Day Ball, but Unwin Peake was, of course, conspiring for his own daughter to win. So Baelor would have had Unwin Peake as a father-in-law instead, which, that's a whole different sort of historical what-if we don't need to get into. So amongst the people who actually were his family members, not Peakes are not included, relationships and influences amongst royal family members are particularly impactful, not just on an individual, but to the realm, because that which shapes a king in turn shapes the realm. So let's talk about the major family members around Baelor in his formative years. After all, even though he was a person that went his own way, he was still influenced by those around him. Of course, we mentioned Aegon III. Let's round that out a bit. We talked about him as a major influence, but there's a little more to it. On one hand, it might seem like Aegon would have been difficult for his children to admire because he was gloomy, withdrawn. Let's be honest, he was traumatized. And yet we know that at least one of Aegon's children, Daena, who would become Daena the Defiant, admired Aegon so much that she dressed in all black like he did and always wore his three-headed dragon pendant. So you could see where Baelor looked to his father as a model of royal humility and duty, despite maybe not being the most pleasant guy to be around. Yeah, Aegon III almost always dressed simply. He didn't wear a lot of bling, shall we say. Didn't wear a lot of jewelry. He did wear his crown, but even that was a simple version. It was the simplest crown, one of the, if not the simplest crown, until maybe Baelor himself. And Aegon famously began his adult reign by canceling a feast that was prepared for him and gave all the food to the commoners, canceled the progress. And yeah, maybe Baelor took inspiration from that, or at least took direction from that to portray himself similarly with simplicity and humility. And it may have been proof. I mean, this was a king that was relatively successful. He inherited a difficult time, that is the post-dance era, and Baelor could look up to that and say, hey, my father did a good job. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe humility is the right way to be. Maybe not being self-serving is the way to go. So, in other words, someone that thought like later stage Stannis, that the kingdom is a privilege, not a right, and something to be taken seriously and selflessly. So yeah, Aegon III was probably the first major influence among many, I guess is another good way we could put it, right, Nina?
Absolutely, absolutely. And to echo everything you've said, I think that simplicity and that humility in Aegon is something that we see very directly translated into Baelor, that he's approaching kingship with this sense of sober duty to the realm rather than self-gratification. But I think it's also worth pointing out that Aegon is probably one of the first, if not the first, influences on Baelor's eventual piety. There's this very small but very intriguing note in Fire and Blood. According to Gildane, as an adult, Aegon III wears a hair shirt under his velvets and court clothes. And we see in the real world and in Westeros as well, hair shirts are used as a means of religious repentance, religious humility. To take Westerosi examples, we see Lancel wearing one when Jaime goes to visit him at Derry. Cersei sees that the warrior sons wear hair shirts when they're escorting her through the capital. Now, we don't know exactly what Aegon III's relationship with the Seven looked like. We don't know exactly why he chose to wear a hair shirt, but I think it's fair to say that Aegon III may have wanted to use this sort of religious mortification tool in order to personally repent for what he might have seen as the sins of his family or the sins of the realm. Again, we say this again and again. Aegon III is someone who experienced so much trauma, so much loss, witnessed so much destruction and devastation as a young child. It's very possible that he decided as an adult, I'm going to repent for all of that. I am going to put on a hair shirt. I am going to mortify myself so that I atone for the sins that caused the dance, for the sins that caused all this destruction. But whatever the specific reasoning was for Aegon III to don this hair shirt, I think we see that, again, very directly translated to Baelor, because this is such a powerful image for Baelor to grow up with. Not only his father, but the Lord of the Seven Kingdoms being so committed to his faith that he is willing to wear a hair shirt under his court clothes, that he is never taking away that repentance and that humility, even as he's appearing as a king. And that's something that we see very much on display by the time we get to Baelor's own reign.
That's very well said, and it's important to emphasize, just if we could encapsulate what the guilt is about, the dance. And framed a different way, though, the Targaryens weren't threatened by an outside force. They had stewardship of the realm. It was their responsibility, and they just blew it all up and killed a lot of innocent people and their own and themselves, right? So that's the heart of the guilt. They had it all, they ruined it, and they have no one to blame but themselves for it, even though Aegon personally wasn't responsible for it. It's his responsibility to lead the atonement for it. Now, he had also braved the winter fever as a young king. Gildane notes that Aegon spent his days visiting the sick, sitting with them, holding their hands, listening to them. This is something we also see from Daenerys during the Pale Mare outbreak, and it makes her followers pretty nervous that she's doing it. Yet she does it, and it's ultimately a success. And I imagine Aegon III's court wasn't so thrilled with him doing this too. Yet it set the example, and people like Baelor, probably most of all, were impacted by it.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I don't think we should underemphasize just how devastating the winter fever was as well. I mean, we're talking about a disease that wipes out half the population of Sisterton, that kills thousands of people in cities like White Harbor and Goldtown, that apparently killed 3/4 of the people who were infected. This is a very, very devastating disease. And yet, Aegon III is completely willing to put his own body on the line to visit the sick, to sit with them, to comfort them, to give them whatever it is as king that he can give. So I think, obviously Baelor isn't alive when the winter fever happens, but there are plenty of people, no less his father himself, at court who would have remembered this happening, who would have heard stories about this happening, and would have passed those on to Baelor. And so as Baelor is hearing these stories, I think he couldn't have helped but felt impressed and felt inspired. This is a king who, despite not having an heir himself, when the winter fever is happening, Aegon III has no children. He does not have an heir. There is no plan if he dies. And yet, he is completely willing to expose himself to a devastating disease because this is what his people need. And so I think the lesson that Baelor takes away is no king and no aristocrat is so great that he cannot put himself at the use of the least of his people. If your people are suffering, it is your job as king to personally see to their suffering. And if you can't do that, then you should not be king. I think that's the lesson that Baelor takes away from his father's example with the winter fever. And the other part of this is, again, Aegon III doesn't, in fact, get the winter fever. And there are stories that go around that, oh, he must have these healing hands because this is how people survive. Almost certainly not the case. But as Baelor is hearing these stories, I think he may have also taken away the idea of, well, it doesn't matter. If I have enough faith, if I have enough faith in myself, if the gods are approving of what I'm doing, then it won't matter what I expose myself to, what physical dangers I expose myself to, because I'm justified by the gods in doing so.
Yeah, it really is demonstrative when you go amongst the sick and you touch them and spend lots of time around them and you come out of that unscathed. That really reinforces the old divine right to rule aspect of that upholds all of the Targaryen monarchy, especially without their dragons to back them up anymore. So yeah, that's a huge point, that going into that fire and coming out unscathed, something Targaryens occasionally know things about, is reinforcement of their right to rule, which might be at odds in this time because of the loss of dragons, which is when people are questioning, hey, maybe the Targaryens shouldn't be in charge anymore because, hey, they've lost that thing that made them special. So it's important for them to reestablish that. And that might not be what Aegon is even thinking or what Baelor is even thinking, but it absolutely has that effect. Now, on the negative side, Baelor may have taken some of the wrong ideas from Aegon's reign. For example, Yandel describing Aegon being kind of cold, right? Not necessarily cold in terms of outcomes, but in terms of personal dealings, right? What do you think about that?
Well, absolutely. And again, I don't want this to come across as me criticizing Aegon III because he's so cold, because, well, it's completely understandable. He experiences so much trauma and loss as a child that, yeah, I completely sympathize with him. But I think where the flaw is coming from in that coldness when it comes to those he ruled, I think it's because Aegon III doesn't set a lot of store on being popular or getting the love of his subjects. We see that when he reaches his majority and he says, cancel the progress in my name. I don't want that. He's not concerned with being seen and being acclaimed and, you know, the metaphorical flowers thrown in his path. He just wants to do right by his people. And that's not an ignoble sentiment, but I think the lesson, and perhaps the bad lesson, that Baelor may have taken away is that, well, if I get any criticism as king, it doesn't really matter, because as long as I think I'm doing the right thing for my people, that's really the only thing that matters, right? Because that's what my father is doing. And, well, if he's not very warm toward the people and he really doesn't care about the people's love, he just wants to do right, well, as long as I want to do right by them, then I don't really care what kind of criticism I get for it.
Yeah, it's a little bit like he's brewing and drinking his own Kool-Aid there to a certain extent. Like, he's cutting his own path. He's doing things that no one's done before. So that naturally means he's going to get criticism he's going to have to ignore, which might overshadow some legitimate criticisms. Now, let's talk about his uncle, Prince Viserys, who was hand to the king for a very long time, brother to Aegon. Aegon and Viserys loved each other, but they had very different personalities in a lot of ways. And Viserys also would have had a big influence on Baelor, but like I said, different kind of person, so different kind of influence, huh?
Absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, like Baelor, Viserys is born the second son of his parents' marriage. And like Baelor, Viserys was heir presumptive for his older brother. I mentioned this briefly before, but Viserys was heir presumptive for the better part of 10 years. Between the time he returns from exile in about 134 to the birth of Prince Daeron in 143. And so Baelor would have seen Viserys constantly. We know Viserys serves as hand at some point during Aegon III's reign, but even when he's not officially hand, I think Viserys was something like a right-hand man for his brother, one of the very, very few people in the world Aegon III felt that he could trust. And so Baelor is probably seeing Viserys pretty constantly, not just as his uncle, but also as his own father's right-hand man. And as Baelor is seeing Viserys and seeing everything that he's doing, what he's seeing is the prime example of a second son who is nearly as powerful and commanding as his older royal brother, if not more so. Because again, as Yandel mentions that Aegon III is cold and unwilling to court his own people, it's Viserys who has to be that sort of charming, popular, public face of the crowd. It's Viserys who has to smooth things over for the people. And so for Baelor, Viserys might have seemed like proof that a younger son, a second son, who's never necessarily destined for the throne himself, could assume royal authority pretty easily if and when the need arose. Viserys is not shy about almost co-ruling with his brother. Viserys is not shy about becoming the second most powerful person in the kingdom. And so as Baelor is looking at his uncle, he's seeing, well, just because he's a second son, that doesn't at all mean that he can't wield power, that he can't step naturally into the shoes of power. And Viserys may have also been the first person that Baelor saw to attempt to restore the dragons after their extinction, at least temporary extinction, in 153 AC. And this may have been the start of convincing Baelor that the Targaryen dynasty really did need dragons to enforce royal power. Clearly, this was the argument that Viserys was using, even if Aegon III wasn't exactly into that sort of argument. He's not called the Dragonbane for no reason. Now, of course, what we know is that Viserys' attempts and every attempt between the Extinction and Daenerys fails. But because it fails, I think Baelor may have thought, well, why is this failing? Clearly, we're not doing something right. And that may have started the wheels turning in his own head to say, well, if my uncle doesn't know the right formula, maybe I do. Maybe I know the better way that we can get back to our draconic glory, so to speak.
And that method, of course, is just being more faithful, right? Something along those lines. Turn more and more towards the seven. Surely that'll work, because everybody knows the seven have everything to do with the birth of dragons, right? Yeah, it's really interesting to think about it that way and how this must have felt to them at the time, and just the shadow of dragons having so recently gone away. And we know Aegon wouldn't have been convinced by his brother's arguments to restore the dragons, because this is Aegon the Dragonbane, the man who saw his mother eaten by a dragon in front of him. He was not listening to that argument. So by the time he was gone, his brother might have been ready to be like, hey, let's revisit this idea. Let's maybe try to get these dragons out there. Now, as far as his brother, this is a person who may have made use of a dragon, considering his martial personality. Daeron, the young dragon himself, he didn't literally believe himself a dragon like, say, Aerys would later, but he thought of himself as the equivalent of one, capable as a dragon. And he's very high on the list of characters who qualify for the night and day brother trope, which is, of course, a very famous trope, because it's not actually uncommon in real life. Neither is it for sisters, although it doesn't happen quite as often in terms of royal families. But hey, it does happen even there. So this is a very interesting one because, wow, you got the extremely martial king, the guy who's ready to attack Dorne, like before he even turned 16, versus the guy who walks to Dorne to establish peace with them and say, I'm sorry for what my brother did. So yeah, talk to us about this for a minute. It's quite the impression, quite the setup.
Absolutely. And certainly, I agree with you in terms of Daeron and Baelor were almost certainly compared from a very early age, maybe as early as babyhood. They're probably being compared because, well, they're only a year apart, and the Targaryen dynasty hasn't had baby princes in quite a number of years, since probably Aegon III himself, or at least maybe the children of Aegon II as well. And so it's very natural, I think, for courtiers to have compared Daeron and Baelor as they're growing up. And to your point, they are so different as they're growing up. We see Daeron, this is almost precociously talented warrior and military commander. This is someone who, by the time he's 14, is ready to lead a campaign, a successful campaign in Dorne of conquest. And on the other hand, you've got Baelor, who, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, but I think from a pretty early age was probably pretty pious, not terribly interested in war, not terribly made out to be a warrior. And so it may have been very natural for courtiers and onlookers who are watching these two brothers grow up to say, oh, well, thank goodness we have Daeron as the elder son, because he's everything that a Westerosi king should be. You know, he's the military commander. He's going to lead us into glory. Baelor, well, let's be glad that he's just to the spare. He's too pious. He's too weak. He's not going to be able to lead an army. And again, they don't know necessarily what's going to happen in the future, of course, but I think it's very obvious to make these contrasts from a very early age. But, and this is a very important but, I do think there is a way in which Daeron and Baelor are a lot more similar than they might appear. Again, not in terms of their inclination to war, and not in terms of their policies toward Dorne, obviously. But what we see with both Baelor and Daeron is this extreme self-confidence in themselves as monarchs, even in circumstances where they're coming to the throne somewhat unexpectedly. Yes, Daeron is the heir apparent of his father, but he's only 14 when his father dies, so ostensibly he should have a regency. And yet, Daeron says, no, there's no need for a regency, and in fact, I've got a plan right now as to how we're going to conquer Dorne, and we're going to do that. And same thing for Baelor. Baelor's only 17 when he comes to the throne. He certainly doesn't expect his brother to be assassinated, and yet immediately, almost as soon as the crown hits his head, he says, yep, I've got a plan to make peace with Dorne, and this is what's going to happen. There is no hesitation for either brother on coming to the throne, no matter the circumstances by which they become king. They are ready to hit go from the minute the crown touches their brow.
That's so true. Yeah, they're both radicals in completely different ways. It's funny. You're right. It's like almost like Baelor had that plan all along. He's like, well, if my brother dies, I'm going to walk to Dorne. That's what's going to happen. And now, what about his cousins? Who should we think about there as an influence? He had a lot of cousins. There were some older folks in his family that were becoming established, and some others that had been around a little bit longer. What do you think about that?
Well, I think of all of his cousins, and especially here when we're going to talk about the three children of the future Viserys II, I think Baelor probably would have been closest to Nerys. Nerys is the closest to him in age. He's only about 6 years older than he is. But they're also both extremely pious Targaryens. They are very deep in the faith of the Seven. Both of them very much believe in the faith of the Seven. So much so that Nerys actually wanted to become a septa before he was forcibly married to her brother Aegon. And I think especially Baelor might have seen Nerys's marriage, this very, very, very unhappy marriage that he's forced into with Aegon, as almost a warning, almost this sense of, this is what you want to avoid. This is a warning to you, don't do this. That as he's looking at this, is he thinking, oh, well, this is, not to get ahead of ourselves, but this is a consequence of us turning away from the gods, and that's what I don't want. And so if Nerys can't become a septa because her father won't allow it, well, when I'm king, I'm going to do whatever I want when it comes to taking my own holy orders. I think that's very, very possible. That's not to say that Baelor wouldn't have also been potentially close to his cousin Aemon. Because Aemon is also very pious. Not quite to the extent Nerys is, but certainly a very pious person himself. And so Baelor, I think, may have appreciated that Aemon is, yes, he's a warrior, yes, he's a knight, but he is a very pious knight. He is a very dutiful knight. So he's someone that Baelor may have been able to look up to, perhaps in a way that he couldn't with his own brother, Daeron. Of course, when it comes to Aegon, the future Aegon IV, I really doubt that they had anything in common whatsoever. Because if you can think of someone who is about as opposite to Baelor as you could be, I think it's the future Aegon IV. So I doubt they had very much to talk about at all. And of course, we really don't know anything about Rhaena's and Baela's children. So to whatever extent Baelor might have had a relationship with them as well, something that maybe we'll encounter in Blood and Fire or maybe some future works, but for right now we just can't say.
Yeah, I gotta agree with that. As much as Daeron and Baelor were opposites, Aegon IV and Baelor were even more opposite. That's a good point. Yeah, like talk about just polar opposites, everything about them. The guy who wouldn't eat versus the guy that ate constantly, the guy that wouldn't sleep with anyone versus the guy that slept with everyone. Yeah, there's just so much there. Last but not least, as far as family, though, sisters. Of course, during Baelor's life, his sisters would be a constant source of, problem for him. His temptation, his struggling and wrestling with the notion of marriage to his own sister versus Targaryen custom versus what the Faith of the Seven believes, which is you shouldn't do that. But it's not like he ever married someone else, so this was very complicated for him. So give us a little bit about his sisters before we get into some other topics.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that Baelor probably had certainly the most lasting impact on his second sister, Rhaena. Because Rhaena is dutiful, she's meek, she's passive, she's pious. These are all qualities that not only I think Baelor believed himself to have, but also believed that women generally should probably have. And so I think he may have been the closest to Rhaena in interest and personality because they're both very much devoted to the Faith of the Seven. In fact, Yandel calls Rhaena almost as pious as Baelor, which I think Baelor probably would have thought pretty high praise. If you can be almost as pious as the most pious of all the Targaryens, that's pretty high praise in Baelor's mind, I think. And of course, Rhaena would eventually become a septa, and I would bet anything that Baelor had an impact on her choice to enter this religious life, because not only are they both devoted to the faith and probably shared a lot of conversations about the faith, but Baelor himself becoming a septon after he becomes king may have inspired Rhaena to say, well, if you can take religious vows, so will I. I'm going to pursue this just as much as you will. Definitely not as close to Baelor, I think, is his sister Daena, because I think Daena is much more like their brother Daeron in personality. Now, of course, Daena and Baelor would be forced to become much closer, but that will be still to come in just a couple moments. And as far as Alina goes, I'm not sure how much influence Baelor had on her. Certainly, she was not nearly, so far as we know, as pious as Rhaena, and she definitely did not become a septa later in life. So I'm not sure to what extent Baelor believed he had an impact on Alina. Again, this is something that I'm really curious to see if Blood and Fire or future works we'll talk more about.
That's a good point in general to have everyone be aware of, is there is a lot about Baelor and these other characters that we have yet to discover, because his life hasn't been directly covered by any of the texts other than a little bit in the World of Ice and Fire, and quite a bit of mention in A Song of Ice and Fire here and there. So we have a lot to say about him despite the lack of knowledge. But one day we hopefully will have quite a bit more that we can add to this and maybe rethink some things. Let's talk about, of course, the biggest thing to do with him, the fact that he was so faithful and pious and religious. Obviously, we've mentioned how a lot of this comes from within his family, but it's more to that too. And it's not like he's the guy that made them pious. It's not like Baelor himself is the one that turned the Targaryens in this direction. It's just perhaps he was the most extreme of those who went in this way. The ones of the Targaryen monarchs who were among the faithful, the ones who invested a lot of time and effort into the faith, whether sincere or not. He was the most of that. So how did this begin for him? What do you think? Let's just talk about how this all developed and what other things happened in his early life that maybe reinforced this belief or strengthened it or just forged him into the man he became.
No, absolutely. And again, just to echo everything that you're saying, Baelor's piety is the single most important aspect to Baelor's character. I mean, literally, Baelor is defined by his piety. He is almost never mentioned, except as Baelor the Blessed, or Blessed Baelor, or the Septon King. You cannot separate Baelor from his belief in the Faith of the Seven. And so, to your point, I think it is very worth thinking about, where did that sense of piety come from? And as you know, It wasn't that the Targaryens never believed in the faith of the Seven before Baelor. We have examples of Targaryens like Maegelle, like Daella, like to some extent Alysanne, who are very much pious Targaryens that existed before Baelor. And it's not to say that the Targaryens never believed in the faith of the Seven after Baelor as well, but I think it's worth focusing on the generational aspect to piety at this time within House Targaryen. Because if we think about the 8 children who are born between Aegon III and the future Viserys II, fully half of them are specifically noted for their deep devotion to the faith of the Seven. And that's a proportion of specifically pious Targaryens that we don't see in any of House Targaryen. That's huge. And so when it comes to that, and again, keep in mind, these Targaryens are not wildly far apart in age. Daenerys is only 6 years older than Baelor. Rhaena is a couple years younger. Aemon is a couple years older than Daenerys. So these are not Targaryens who are growing up in wildly different circumstances. They're all experiencing roughly the same circumstances, roughly the same events that are happening at court and at Westeros at large. And so when we have such a high proportion of specifically very pious Targaryens in this generation, I think there has to have been something going on that was affecting all of them. In other words, this is not a moment of purely personal conversion, the way we see with, for example, Lancel in the main novels. I think this is something that's affecting all of the Targaryens, something they're all seeing that is deepening all of them in the faith. And to that end, I think there is one very obvious answer. It's the decline and extinction of the dragons. But not just the decline and extinction of the dragons in its own right, but this decline and extinction specifically in the context of the doctrine of exceptionalism. Because remember, what's the doctrine of exceptionalism all about? What does the doctrine of exceptionalism rest on? Dragons. And that's not me reading between the lines. That's not me sort of kind of guessing something that's subtly in there. Oh no, this is explicit in the description and defense of the doctrine of exceptionalism. When we see the 7 speakers go around Westeros to try to explain this doctrine during the reign of Jaehaerys I, they are explaining this using dragons. So one of them refers to the Targaryens as exceptional because they are the blood of the dragon. Their words, not mine. And in another anecdote, one of the 7 speakers is in a village and they're explaining the doctrine of exceptionalism. And one of their listeners says, all right, well, if that's the case, can I go marry my sister? And what's the response? If you can go to Dragonstone and claim a dragon, I'll marry you to your sister myself. It is very direct, very explicit. The Targaryens are the only masters of dragons in the world. And because they are the only masters of dragons in the world, they are exceptional. And because they are exceptional, they get to practice incest while no other believer in the faith of the Seven gets to practice incest. A to B to C. So now flip that idea on its head. What happens if the Targaryen dragons start getting smaller, start getting weaker, aren't being born as frequently, are not living very long when they are being born, when they eventually die out in 153 AC? What does the doctrine of exceptionalism look like then? Because if I'm a Targaryen, perhaps already inclined to piety in this generation, and I'm watching this happen in real time, and remember, all of these pious Targaryens are alive and well when the last dragon dies. If I'm watching this decline and extinction happen in real time, am I thinking, oh, we messed up? The doctrine of exceptionalism, this isn't a way to justify incest in the eyes of the Seven. This is a heresy. This is something the gods are not happy about us doing. And because they're not happy, they're taking away our dragons. They are punishing us for practicing incest and promoting this heresy by taking away the means we had to promote this heresy, the dragons. And I want to be clear here. This is not an idea that is coming out of nowhere. This is, in fact, an idea that we've already encountered in the main novels and in Fire and Blood. The idea that the Targaryen incest is something that is specifically punishable by the gods, and that the dragons may be punished alongside them. We see in A Clash of Kings, when the Cerwyn men come to Winterfell for the harvest feast, one of them mentions that Joffrey is now reported, truthfully, to be the son of Jaime Lannister. And what's the comment from another one of the Cerwyn men? The gods hate incest. Look how they brought down the Targaryens. Now, obviously, he's talking about the old gods, but I don't think that we should throw away the point just because we're talking about a different religion here, because after all, the Faith of the Seven preached for thousands of years that incest is a sin and the products of incest are abominations. So the Seven are no more okay with incest than the old gods are. But even more on point, when we're talking about Baelor and talking about the Targaryens of this generation, we have what would have been for them a very recent historical memory. And that's the preaching of the shepherd at the tail end of the Dance of the Dragons. Because what's the shepherd's message? It's one in which incest and dragons and Valyria are all pitted as sinful against the gods. The shepherd describes Valyria as the cesspit, specifically because of the practice of incest among the dragon lords. He refers to the dragons as demons out of hell. He is very clearly describing dragons as something that is being used to negatively justify incest against the will of the gods. And to the shepherd, the doom was the punishment of the gods on Valyria for these sins, for the practice of incest. And to that end, for the shepherd, the dance is the second doom. It is a way for the Seven to punish both the Targaryens and their dragons for escaping the doom, for what the shepherd describes as mocking the gods by trying to get out of what, in the shepherd's eyes, rightful punishment. And so he calls on people in King's Landing to destroy the dragons because this is the only way that they can cleanse themselves of sin and put themselves back in what we might call the good books of the Seven. Now again, Baelor, his sister, his cousins, they weren't around for this themselves. But this is an event that's happening barely 15 years before Baelor is born. This is something that people at court, his own father included, would have remembered happening, would have heard about happening, may have even heard it happen in real time. And so, again, as they're growing up and watching these dragons decline and eventually go extinct, it may not have seemed that strange to say, hey, maybe the shepherd was right. maybe the gods are punishing us. Maybe this was wrong. Maybe we should not have been practicing incest. Maybe we shouldn't have come up with the doctrine of exceptionalism. And maybe what we need to do is get back to square one with the gods, to get on a clean slate, to redevote ourselves to the faith of the Seven, because this is the only way that we can atone for this sin in the eyes of the Seven.
It's like if you imagine the hair shirt that Aegon III was wearing. If you look closely at it, you would see that it also said, the shepherd was right on it. They were passing those T-shirts around in this era. That's right, yeah. So this brings us to a really interesting point that's hard to figure. If everything was being filtered through the eyes of the Seven, if Baelor was seeing everything through the eyes of the Seven and framing it that way, believing that they were in charge, that his faith dictated that to him, it did create a lot of conundrums. Like you said, the dragons being gone might have been a positive thing, yet he still was at least convinced or believed it a positive thing to try to bring them back. Perhaps under his auspices, that's kind of unclear, something that we'll talk about off and on. But just in general, the idea of him having dreams and or visions, supernatural or not, he would perceive them as such in a way that prior Targaryens may have seen differently. Aegon the Conqueror had a dream that foretold the coming of the others in some way or another. We don't exactly know how he perceived it, but he believed it was a vision of the future. He didn't think it came from the Seven, But if Baelor had some sort of dream like that, or any other dream, he would believe that it came directly from the Seven. And that's a really important thing to consider, that all these things flow through that belief system, unlike most Targaryens, if not all Targaryens before him. So he would take them seriously, just in a very different way than prior Targaryens did. He may have had dreams that we're not privy to. In fact, he surely did. Of course, we don't have a perfect record of all his dreams. Even when Blood and Fire comes out, we won't have that. He may have lied about what he saw. I don't think that, but he could have definitely been wrong. That, I think 100%, 110% even, that he would have very, shall we say, willful interpretations of what he might not have, or what he might have seen and might not have seen. And that would affect him quite a bit, I think, as someone that had so much faith. He would have no choice to engage with these dreams and to take them seriously, and perhaps eventually affect policy when he eventually became king.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you make a good point when you say it's so unclear at this point, because we don't have a good sense as to what extent the author wants us to interpret any dream that Baelor had or might have had as specifically prophetic, specifically in the line of what we call, Targaryen dreaming, dragon dreaming, whatever it is that you want to call it. And it's also worth pointing out that George R. Martin has written himself an out here. When Jaime visits Lancel at Derry, Lancel, tells Jaime that he's dreaming, that the Seven are sending him dreams, which of course Jaime doesn't actually believe the Seven are doing. So it's very possible that George R. Martin wants us to see Baelor in that way, in someone who maybe he believes that he's receiving dreams or visions from the Seven, but this is not actually the case, whether because he's fasting, whether because he wants it to be true, whatever it may be. So, and, on a personal level, and this is a very me thing, I'm not holding anyone else to the standard, but I tend to limit the amount of Targaryens or Targaryen relations that I think are having prophetic dreams, if only because I think it tends to lessen the specialness of any one of them. Again, that's not to say this couldn't be the case with Baelor. It's not to say that George R. R. Martin isn't going to make it the case with Baelor. I think it's something that just at this moment, I think we need a little bit more information and more context to in order to determine how the author wants us to read it.
My focus has been greatly enhanced by using Rise productivity software. I tend to have a mind that wanders a lot, and I'm clicking on other tabs, looking at stuff that's maybe not exactly what I should be focusing on. But Rise is really good about reminding me what I'm supposed to be focusing on, or what I've set out to focus on, and that's really helpful. Also, it's just good for tracking how much work I've gotten done in a day, which can be satisfying to manage, and it's nice to be able to look back on your day and have a sense of what you've actually accomplished or haven't accomplished, if that is the case.
I like Rise because I feel that it's catered towards a more personal approach.
Yeah.
Rather than being accountable to a boss, you're accountable to yourself.
Exactly. Click the link in the description and use the code Westeros3 to get 25% off your first 3 months of a subscription. Join us as a supporter at patreon.com/History of Westeros to get things like bonus episodes, access to scripts, shoutouts, and more. From the depths of Fleabottom, Lord Ken of House Hammer has declared for Queen Curry, Fire of the North, who recovered Dark Sister from beyond the wall. Peter Blaze of the Emerald Isle, captain of the Werewood Wanderers, to long lives, quick deaths, cold beer, and warm women. Daegron, Marshal of the Axe, captain of the Red Tide, resistance is futile. Kyron Callsbane, captain of the Stone Shields, the torrent breaks upon the stone. Haema Helminth, captain of the Whispering Children, dead men tell no secrets. Shepard, the Shepherd of Essos, all men are sheep before the shepherd, heir to the Whispering Children. Lady Lajara Dajo, the Iron Lily, Master Archer, Castellan of the Summer Island Keep Arboreal Point, and captain of the all-female Wailing Widows, women and children first. Lord Brandon Brewer of Castle Blackroon, captain of the Shadow Wolves. Our steel is cold, our vengeance colder. Black Alex Sand, the Bastard of Spears, leader of the Bermuda Vanguard. Vorian of House Betterfetter, captain of the Golden Fetters. We face our oppression with style. Aegon the Underestimated, captain of the Clanking Dragons. Our clank is clank as clank. Lady Sarah Connolly the Willful, wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure. Jenny's patron. Maester Malachi, forgotten dragon seed from the Isle of Driftmark, now in service to House Harlaw. And Stives the White, captain of the Hopeful Patriots, a band of exile knights. The world ends when hope dies. So Baelor would have served as heir presumptive to Daeron for the entirety of his brother's 4-year reign. It wasn't a very long reign, but this is early in Baelor's life. So, the years are longer when you're young because you've experienced fewer of them. So Baelor wasn't old at this point. He wasn't an adult yet, but of course, being 13 is when you're a prince. You've learned a lot. You've seen a lot. Of course, they had a lot of weight on his shoulders, and this is a very serious boy, So in a lot of ways, he was ahead of his years, mature beyond his years, even if there were a lot of things about the world he didn't understand or know, still very advanced, I think. And his brother invades almost right away. So just kicking off the bat, the reign of a warlike king, 13-year-old, what a change of pace. He goes from Aegon III, who was repentant and guilty and traumatized, to this, an invasion of Dorne, which was successful at first, right? It went well. And then it fell completely apart. His brother returns to reconquer Dorne and gets killed in the process of that at the old peace banner incident that was so famous that we talked about in the episode on Daeron himself. So if you want more info on that, make sure to check that episode out. So not only was Daeron at war most of the time of this relatively short 4-year reign, he wasn't there, like at war, literally at war, not at court. He's not out here giving policy. He's at war they Viserys is still hand of the king. And it's a very unusual set of circumstances there. You could very much think, they might not be worried that Daeron's just going to die. But it had to cross their minds that at any given moment, a raven could fly back and be like, brother died in Dorne. Bad things have happened down there before. Meraxes was shot down there, right? Orys lost his hand. Lots of bad things happened to Targaryens in Dorne. So there might have been a little anxiety, a little worry around the court, as confident as Daeron was. I don't know about everybody else. So what do you think the mood at court was, especially for Baelor, but everybody else as well, because that would have influenced him being a young man. The fact that he just might all of a sudden inherit the Iron Throne.
Well, and again, I do think that it's a very interesting time and something that I certainly hope we get more detail on in Blood and Fire or future works, because I could very much see where, yes, Baelor is definitely young at this time. He doesn't reach his majority until the tail end of Daeron's reign. But to your point, Baelor is the heir presumptive for the entirety of Daeron's reign. And so, yes, even though no one necessarily expects Daeron to die, no one necessarily thinks that Daeron isn't going to have children of his own, as Daeron is physically not there, it may have been easy for courtiers and onlookers to look at Baelor and say, how is he measuring up? What does he look like as the heir? Because, I just made this point a moment ago. I think Baelor probably would have already been seen as a pretty pious individual. And whether or not he had ever announced what he wanted to do or was going to do in the event, which he didn't know at that point, he became king, it's very possible that given what he did end up doing, Baelor may have been vocal in his opposition to the war or stated his opposition to the war. He may have even been the focus, consciously or not, of whatever anti-war party may have existed at court. Not that I would think it was a majority party, given how Daeron leads the campaign in Dorne, but to the extent there is an anti-war party, I think Baelor would have been the focus of that and may have made himself the focus of that to say, I don't believe in this war. I believe the war is wrong. I believe that we should be fostering peace with Dorne. And so, again, as Daeron is gone, our courtiers looking at Baelor and saying, what's going to happen if he becomes king? If the contrast was great when Daeron and Baelor were growing up together and could be seen side by side, the contrast might have seemed even greater when Daeron is gone and Baelor is standing there, the visible symbol of what happened if Daeron dies without an heir. Now, all of that is to say, I don't think Baelor was actually wielding that much, if any, power at this time at court. I think his uncle probably kept a pretty tight hold on government control. And I think that would have been expected. Viserys is the senior member of House Targaryen by age and experience. He's someone who did serve as hand for Aegon III, who continued to serve as hand for Daeron. So it may have just seemed simply natural that Viserys would be the one running the government rather than Baelor himself. And if Baelor isn't necessarily expressing an interest in running government, in becoming regent in the way we see with, for example, Aemond during the Dance of the Dragon, then it may not have seemed quite the contrast that it may otherwise have between Daeron and Baelor. And of course, for Viserys himself, he may not have been very interested in sharing power with Baelor either, because of course Baelor is young. And to whatever extent Viserys might have understood this, if he believes that Baelor is not a fan of the war, not supportive of the war, well, then better to just leave him out of government entirely and leave him as simply a possible future heir in, again, 7 forbid, the event that Daeron dies.
Yeah, there was probably an expectation that he would eventually have children. He was young, he was warlike, and as we said at first, he was successful. So yes, Baelor was the heir presumptive, but it was also presumptive that this would pass. That's why the title is called presumptive heir, because there's an expectation that it won't stay that way. It's not like you're next in line because you're the firstborn of the king. It's like a temporary heir status, but could become permanent. But of course, what actually happened was, ironically, as there would have been maybe some anxiety that Daeron would have died, after winning the war and then losing Dorne, going back, there was probably more of an assumption of his safety because he had been so successful to date. Even though Dorne overthrew his rule, he hadn't lost battles. Overall, he was doing well. The perception of Daeron was that he was a winner. So when he did die finally, maybe not finally, it didn't take that long. He only reigned for 4 years. But when it happened, it probably was a bit of a shock, and it certainly caused a lot of chaos, right? It was, well, now the pious guy is king, the one that Viserys is keeping a lockdown on, the one that maybe he didn't agree with. And it's interesting, too, because, well, you just had this young king that took the kingdom in one direction very dramatically, but now you have, again, the night and day. the one sets for the other to rise, and that takes the kingdom in a completely different direction. Now, you've seen some other examples of this before, for example, in A Song of Ice and Fire, one of our best places to find examples. And you pointed out here that Bran and Rob are a perfect example of this, aren't they?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we see Bran in A Clash of Kings, who's serving as the Prince of Winterfell, as Rob's heir presumptive. Again, no one expects that Rob will not go on to marry and have children. And in fact, he will marry, although not have children. But so far as he doesn't, Bran, as the next in line for House Stark, as the next male of House Stark, is sitting in Winterfell as not only Rob's heir presumptive, but also as the prince in Winterfell, as the representative of House Stark. Now, Bran is limited in terms of what he can do, both because he is young, even younger than Baelor is at this period, and also because of his disability. There's only so much that Westeros is quite an ableist society. There's only so much that Westeros is going to expect a disabled heir, even if he is heir, to be able to do. But even his presence, even being there and representing House Stark, is an important role for Bran to play. And it is interesting to consider, would Baelor have been used in that same capacity? Again, I tend to think perhaps not, and that's because I think we have the presence of Prince Viserys. You know, there is no equivalent uncle in A Clash of Kings. There's no adult male Stark who can represent the house while his nephew is serving as heir presumptive. By contrast, what we have in Baelor's time and during the reign of Daeron, Viserys is that experienced Targaryen statesman. He is the experienced Targaryen prince. So he can be the face of House Targaryen as he was during the reign of Aegon III and leave Baelor sort of to the side.
Yeah, and the equivalent for the Starks is sort of a committee of Maester Luwin and Sir Roderick and folks who don't quite have Prince Viserys's gumption or experience at rule or confidence at it or just being raised to do these sort of things, right? I mean, maesters aren't supposed to rule.
No, and they're also not Starks. I mean, they're also not Starks, and that's
right.
that's the important thing here. There's something that Bran can do simply by virtue of being a Stark. He is the Stark in Winterfell. He can take power as Lord of Winterfell if Robb dies, in a way that Maester Luwin can't, and Sir Roderick can't, and other members of the Winterfell household, who are definitely devoted to House Stark and definitely have the best interests of House Stark in mind, simply can't. Whereas Viserys, although he's not heir presumptive, he is not someone who is going to automatically become king if Daeron dies. He is a Targaryen. He is a prince of the royal dynasty. He does have a place in that succession. And so it's a little bit easier to stand out for Viserys as the representative of House Targaryen and more or less put his nephew to the side.
Yeah, and unlike Daeron, Robb did get married earlier, like you said, but didn't have kids. So I love that parallel, Daeron and Robb, but it's like the first parallel lives I ever took note of. And of course, George made it somewhat explicit very early on in the series. But the Baelor Bran parallel is quite strong, too. You have both of them trekking through the wilderness, through extremes. In Bran's case, it's extreme winter. In Baelor's case, it's through Dorne. And they're both deep in their religion. Obviously, Bran deep into the old gods, Baelor with the Seven. And yeah, there's a lot of parallels like that. Both of them go through a lot and lose a lot of their physical capacity. Obviously, Baelor isn't fully crippled, but a lot of things happen to him to make him lose some of his physicality and make him frail. So yeah, I like that parallel quite a bit. And also, this is where we have a fun question. Let me give my guess and then you can give yours. The question of whether Baelor was meek and dutiful towards his brother and supported the war, or whether he was an outspoken opponent of it. I'm super interested in that question. Yes, we won't truly know till Blood and Fire, or maybe something George inserts in the Winds of Winter that would give us a clue there. But I tend to think he was outspoken. I just think the way this guy was, maybe he started off different, maybe because of the tenets of his faith, say, be dutiful to your older brother. Maybe that's the way he saw it. But I think that he was just a stronger personality than that, and that he would have argued against the war from the start and would have kept that gas pedal pressed even if a lot of people weren't listening to him, which I doubt they were. I imagine most people were all for it, especially because it was going well at first. Is that kind of how you fall on it too, or do you think that he was more someone who emerged later and was meek at first?
Oh, no, absolutely. I'm 100% in agreement. I think he is someone who believed from the start that the war was wrong. And we'll get into reasons why I believe that in a little bit. But I do think that he was someone who was outspoken about it. Maybe not, and again, he may not have had the platform if Viserys was keeping him out of power and was not allowing him to sit on the royal councils and represent House Targaryen. But Baelor can do a lot of things that are not necessarily standing at council and saying, I believe the war is wrong. If he's making a public show of, I'm going to pray publicly that we achieve peace, and I'm going to pray for the conversion of my brother. I'm going to pray that he turns his heart to peace. Statements like that, while not necessarily standing up in front of council and saying we need to stop the war, would very clearly demonstrate how he felt about this war and how he believed it. Saying things like, well, I don't believe the Seven should be doing this. I don't believe we should be shedding the blood of other faithful. He can be saying all of this, and I very much believe that he was. And what we see when he becomes king, he reverses course immediately. So I think this was something that he was waiting for the sign of the Seven to do. And the moment he hears his brother's assassination, he thinks, yep, that's it. This is it. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to put this in action.
Let's not forget, too, that Daeron's invasion of Dorne wasn't just unprovoked, but it was something Aegon I promised that his descendants wouldn't do. It was a treaty of eternal peace. So that's another angle for Baelor to have some conviction and some people backing. It was like, look, the founder of our own dynasty said, don't do that. And here you are doing it. So yeah, it would have been interesting if he was outspoken about it. So we'll have to maybe wait one day and find out if that was the case. Let's talk about his marriage that was not very marriage-like to his sister, who became known as Daena the Defiant, in part because of the non-marriage-like aspects of this marriage. But it wasn't only that, was it? There was a lot going on here.
Oh, yes. And this is something that I think we should spend a moment or more considering, because this really is the single event in Baelor's life before he becomes king that we have any detail about. And not to say we have a lot, but we have enough, I think, to really form some interesting speculation on why this marriage is formed, who would have been thinking about this marriage, who would have been arranging this marriage, and of course what happens after the wedding day. We know that Baelor and Daena marry in 160 AC, but we're not given the reason why they married, or how long their marriage had been planned before it happened, or who was arranging it. And so what I want to do is suggest 3 possibilities as to who arranged this marriage and why they might have arranged it. But what I do want to emphasize here is these are not mutually exclusive possibilities. Any one of these, any combination of these, all 3 of these could all be true. And so when we're thinking about this, remember, these are not mutually exclusive possibilities. This is something that, again, we'll probably get more detail in Blood and Fire. This is interesting speculation to think about. Why did Baelor marry Daena?
The expectation would have been for Daeron to marry Daena because he's the oldest and Daena's the oldest sister, and they're not that far apart in age, but instead it was Baelor and Daena. So right there we have a little bit of something unusual. And that requires a little explanation. What do you think?
No, absolutely. And I think that there's a distinct possibility that this marriage, or at least a betrothal, would have been arranged between Baelor and Daena when the 2 of them are quite young and would have been arranged by their father, Aegon III. Now, obviously, he doesn't live to see the marriage happen, but it's certainly traditional within the Targaryen family to pair off siblings as children, even as babies, with the expectation that when they grow up, when they reach their majority or near to their majority by Westerosi standards, they will in fact marry. We see this with, for example, Aegon the Uncrowned and Rhaena, who were paired basically as babies with the expectation that they'll marry. We see Jaehaerys and Alysanne, even their mother Alyssa thinks that Aenys probably would have betrothed them had he lived long enough to do so. And we see this with Jaehaerys and Alysanne to their own children. They betroth Balon and Alyssa unofficially, but then they do in fact get married when the 2 of them are quite young. And they try to do the same with Vaegon and Daella, although that of course does not work out. And so I think it's possible that Aegon III was thinking about this Targaryen tradition and thought, well, maybe I'll have Baelor and Daena marry when they grow older. And you make an interesting point. It's something that I think Aegon III may have had in mind as well. Why betroth the second son? Why betroth Baelor to Daena rather than Daeron? And I think for Aegon III, this may have been a way of balancing, on the one hand, the sort of new political power structure, politico-dynastic, I should say, power structure in Westeros following the dance, and especially following the extinction of the dragons, with this Targaryen tradition, with this tradition that they've inherited from Valyria of incestuous marriage. It's not to say that the Targaryens lose all power when their dragons die out, right? They continue to rule as a dynasty for the better part of 150 years. But what the death of the dragons means for the Targaryens is that they no longer have that independent source of power and authority. And that's crucial because it's no exaggeration, I think, to say that the Targaryen monarchy in Westeros, this united Westerosi kingdom, is literally and figuratively built on the backs of dragons. So when Aegon the Conqueror sets up this kingdom, what is at the heart of this power structure between the Targaryens and their new vassals? It's the dragons. Not only the power that the Targaryens have to punish any rebels that are going to try to challenge the Targaryens for authority, but also for the power of the Targaryens to defend their realm. What we see under Jaehaerys when he defends the realm with his sons from the invasion of Morian Martell. And so without the dragons, the Targaryens don't have that power anymore. The power to put down rebellions from their vassals or the power to defend their vassals. They are now limited to those families in the Crownlands who are sworn directly to House Targaryen and to the power structure that was set up by Aegon the Conqueror, but without the literal and figurative teeth of the dragons behind it. And so the Targaryens are, in a real way, put in the same position as every pre-conquest dynasty in Westeros, dependent upon their own forces and the goodwill of their vassals to stay in power. And so as Aegon III is looking at this and thinking about how to react to that new power structure, that new power balance, is he thinking, well, let's act in the way that pre-conquest dynasties did. And what do pre-conquest dynasties do? What do aristocratic dynasties in Westeros do? They arrange diplomatic marriages. And one of the best bargaining chips for a diplomatic marriage between a liege lord or a king and that king or that liege lord's vassal is the marriage of the king's heir. This is the most important marriage he can make because this is the marriage that's going to secure the power of the dynasty in the future. So any eligible maiden from a vassal family, their family is going to have a direct line to the power of the ruling dynasty. And so maybe Aegon III arranged this betrothal between Baelor and Daena as a way to say, on the one hand, yes, we are Targaryens. We are still special. We are still capital E exceptional. We are still allowed, no matter whether the dragons are dying out or in fact have died out, to marry incestuously. And you still have to respect that, vassals. But we will acknowledge your power because we will leave Daeron open, with the unspoken implication that he will be saved for a diplomatic marriage. So one of you great aristocratic families, you will marry into the Targaryen dynasty. One of your daughters will be queen. You will have that direct route to royal power. It's the second son who will be married incestuously. So again, that power balancing that I think was a hallmark of Aegon III's reign, trying to react to this sort of new world after the decline and extinction of the dragons, Baelor's betrothal to Daena may have been part of that.
Right. Well said. I agree with that. I think it's an interesting sort of line to walk for them to say that, yeah, we still want to keep our traditions. So we're still going to have an incest marriage, but it's not the prime marriage. It's not the number one dynastic marriage. It's not the queen of Westeros that's an incestuous marriage partner. So that's a clever interpretation, and I think it fits really well. Obviously, we're not 100% sure that's right, but I really love how well it fits. Now, another potential here to consider is Daena herself. Obviously, we've considered some of the men in charge here and whether it was a political decision or whether something Daeron decided, look, no, I'm not going to get married. Maybe for all we know, Daena was going to marry Daeron, but once he became king, he said, no, I'm changing that. So that's a possibility as well. But getting back to Daena and the way she felt about this, she might have grown up expecting to be queen because she's the eldest sister. And then all of a sudden, not only is she shut down from that, not only does she have to marry the second son who is not going to be king, well, as it turned out he was, but that wouldn't have been the expectation at the time. He turns out to not want to have anything to really do with her as far as being a wife, which is kind of a problem. And she reacted in a way that, well, she reacted in several ways, but here's a particular one that we have a quote for.
After her brother Baelor failed to consummate their marriage, she changed to all white and vowed to wear nothing else until she had been properly bedded, in hopes of shaming him. It did not work. Baelor liked her in white, feeling that it made her look more innocent.
What is Daena's expectation? Especially because, I like to think that Daena thought of herself as really Rhaenyra reborn, very much in the spirit of her paternal grandmother. And so now not only is she not becoming queen, or at least not as far as she knows, but she's also marrying someone who clearly seems to have no interest in pursuing what for Westeros is expected in a marriage. And I think what's important here is that Daena is trying in a very traditional Westerosi way to make this marriage work. Again, by Westerosi standards. So when she is trying to shame Baelor into marrying her, it is because her expectation is this marriage is going to be consummated. I'm going to have heirs with Baelor. So if that's the expectation, then I'm going to do what I can, sartorially speaking, to get him to do that. And yet, on the flip side, what do we see with Baelor? He's not only rejecting this, he's not only refusing to consummate the marriage, he's actually complimenting her appearance of innocence. He says, oh no, I like you like this. And I think what that speaks to for Baelor is this real distrust and distaste he had for the idea of incestuous marriages. And again, I go back to this idea of the doctrine of exceptionalism and how much the Targaryens, the pious Targaryens of this generation, may have been rebelling against this, may have been saying, no, this is a heresy, this is wrong, we cannot do this, this is something that the gods will punish us for. So Baelor is saying, no, you can force me into a marriage, you can force me to say the words, but I will not consummate this marriage. I will not defy the gods like this. I think it's worth comparing here Baelor's cousin Nerys. Nerys is also forced into an incestuous marriage, also when she wants to become a septa. And after she gives birth to her son Daeron, he asks Aegon, can we live together now as brother and sister? And what that very clearly implies, at least for Nerys, and I think probably for Baelor as well, is that a fraternal relationship, a relationship between siblings, is mutually exclusive with a marital, which in Westerosi context means sexual relationship. They cannot go together. Now, of course, Aegon refuses in a typically for Aegon cruel way, but I think Baelor may have seen this happen, may have known about or heard about this happening and said, all right, well, if I'm going to be forced into an incestuous marriage, then I'm going to go one step further. I will not be forced to consummate this. I will refuse.
Yeah, it's really neat the way that he's able to do that. You're right. He's able to defy the convention by just saying, no, look, this is the one thing I have control over, whether or not we actually sleep together. Like, you can put me in the bed with her. You can lead the horse to water, but you can't make him drink. It's that in a nutshell, I suppose. And he, in fact, does not drink, no matter what anyone tries to do, including her, including the rest of his family. And this is a good example of him really sticking to his convictions. And maybe there's more to it. Maybe he wasn't attracted to women at all. Maybe it made it easier for him to deny himself. But it doesn't sound like it, because later in his life, it sounds like when he puts them in the maiden vault, which we'll get to eventually, it's because he's tempted. So I don't think that he had the quote unquote easier time of rejecting his sisters because he wasn't attracted to them. It sounds like he was. So it was an act of piety, an act of restraint, and an act of control, at least probably from his perspective, and may have seen that way from the outside as well. But to other people, it would have also just seemed like, well, you're resisting your sisters. That's what you're supposed, like, hello, normal, we all do that, right? I hope. So it's just another one of these inherent contradictions that comes up with Baelor, things that don't quite make sense in a way that is very human. Like, he's the conflicted person. It's not like the narrative conflicts. It's not like George messed up. Of course, I'm not saying that. I'm saying this is a character that's just deeply conflicted about his own existence, and that lots of reality brings him back to that. Like, things that are constantly happening around him enhance that conflict and bring it to the forefront, which is why he had a short life, a short reign, and a lot of these other things. And moving on from Daena a little bit, we have more to say about her, but just as an aside, I mean, she's just one of the most interesting and undefined characters of this era. As much as I'm interested in Baelor and some of these other characters, she's one of my favorites, period, and I can't wait to learn more about her, even though it probably won't be soon. So let's continue here. A little more about Baelor and Daena and how it continued forward. What else do you have to say about it?
It's interesting to bring up Daena here, and interesting to bring up, this is expected and the expectations that are surrounding Baelor and Daena, because there's a distinct possibility that this entire marriage was arranged by Daeron I as a means of producing an heir, even another heir presumptive, while he himself did not have children. Now, we know that Daeron never married, although there was a so speak more that said he did, but then World of Ice and Fire says he doesn't, so I'm just going to go ahead and assume that he was not married during his lifetime. But we certainly know that he never had children. And while he may have planned on marrying in the future, may have planned on fathering his own children, he certainly hadn't by 160 AC. And when he's getting to this point, and when he's reaching this point in his reign, I think Daeron may have found himself somewhat in a similar position to Rob in A Storm of Swords. Now, as you yourself mentioned, Aziz, there are plenty of parallels between Daeron and Rob, and I think that this is one of them. Think back to where Rob is in A Storm of Swords, specifically in Catelyn 5, which is such a fantastic chapter in A Storm of Swords. Go back to that chapter. Where is Rob? What is Rob thinking? What is his dilemma? Yes, I've got a wife. yes, without being too crude about it, I'm working on getting an heir, but I don't have one yet. And even in a best case scenario, and forget everything we know is coming about the Red Wedding, even in a best case scenario, thinks Rob, it's gonna be at least 9 months before I have an heir of my body. And in that 9 months, I'm gonna be fighting a lot of battles. And it doesn't matter. I could be the best young commander Westeros has ever seen. It doesn't matter. Because all it takes is one wrong arrow. All it takes is one case of dysentery. All it takes is one parry that comes a little bit too slow, and I'm dead. And what happens to my kingdom then? Who do I leave it to? Now we know Rob's answer. It's Jon Snow. But what we don't know is, was Daeron thinking this same way? I think it's very possible. Because we know, although Daeron receives a submission of Sunspear, he receives the homage of the Prince of Dorne and his vassals, Daeron wasn't done fighting battles in Dorne. He was continuing to go back to Dorne to fight battles, to put down rebellions. And so, like Rob, Daeron may have been thinking, yes, I'm supremely talented. Yes, I'm victorious in every battle I'm fighting, but I'm not immortal. And the next battle could be my last. And if I die, what's gonna happen to my conquest? Hey, Aziz, pop quiz. What happened to Alexander the Great's empire when he died very suddenly without a clear heir?
Ooh, big ol' civil war, big ol' fracturing, lots of different people grabbing for power. Yeah, it wasn't good. Wasn't good,
was it? It wasn't a good time at all. And I think that, just as Rob is a parallel for Daeron, and just as Alexander the Great is a parallel for Daeron, so I think Daeron is also probably worrying about his conquest. Now, Daeron's in a little bit of a different position from Rob in that he does have an heir presumptive in Baelor. There's no question. If he dies, absolutely no question in law, Baelor is going to inherit. No one's going to dispute that. The problem becomes one of, and I really hate to use this term, but I think it's appropriate here, his spiritual successor. Because I think Daeron may have been looking at Baelor and saying, if I die, I have to leave the throne to this chucklehead? Absolutely not. This pious, weak, unmartial wouldn't know what to do with a battalion if I dropped it in his lap. He won't know anything of how to handle a conquest. He's going to destroy everything I've worked for. But what do I do? Well, I can't really name one of my sisters as my heir because, well, we just had that, and it was called The Dance, and it didn't go very well for anyone involved. And yeah, I guess I could name my cousin Aegon, but do I even really like him? Do I think that would fly? It's really not a good solution. What do I do? For Daeron, I think the answer may have been, why don't I marry Baelor to Daena? Because Daena is like me. Daena hero worships me. Daena is martial like me. And so if Daena and Baelor have a son, I can name that boy my heir. He'll have the claim through Baelor. He'll have Daena to guide him. And 7 forbid, if I die before I have an heir of my body, at least I know that there's someone who's connected to the throne who is on the same page as I am, who will know what to do with my conquest, who will believe in continuing the war in Dorne in a way that I don't believe my brother is going to know what to do.
It's an interesting idea to consider that Daeron may have thought Daena would dominate Baelor in their marriage. She would control him, and that, obviously he was wrong, but he would have been right about the idea, if I die early, this guy's going to completely screw up my conquest. Correct. He was not wrong about that. He absolutely did that. He immediately flips like, no, I'm going to unconquer Dorne the second my brother dies. Yeah, it's really interesting to think about what did he think of his brother.
The old adage of George V, King of Great Britain, supposedly said, did not have a very good relationship with his oldest son, the future Edward VIII, and supposedly said, when I die, the boy is going to ruin himself in 12 months. And guess what? Guess how long it took for Edward VIII to abdicate? Just about 12 months.
Yeah, I wonder, did Daeron, respect his brother's, convictions, his strength of belief despite his lack of martial ability, or did he just look down on him? We really have no idea. Daeron's personality is missing, but that's another thing we can look forward to Blood and Fire for. And speaking of historical parallels, we have one for you here, a very nice one. There's two strong historical real-world parallels that Nina prepared for us. One of them we'll save for next time. That's Louis IX of France. Today, we've got Henry VI of England. Tell us about that parallel, Nina.
Yes, with Henry VI. So I think in order for us to talk about Henry VI of England, we actually have to go back to his father, Henry V. I think I did, and if I didn't, I'm kicking myself because I should have, but I think when I was helping make notes on the Daeron the Young Dragon episode, I mentioned Henry V as a parallel for Daeron, along with obviously Alexander the Great and Charles XII and figures like that. And the reason that I point out Henry V specifically as a parallel for Daeron is because I think both of them were very much focused on making good on these sort of ancestral claims to foreign kingdoms via conquest. So Henry V, I'm not even going to attempt to try to summarize the 100 Years' War because that is so wildly complex and long of a history that that's an entire podcast series in itself. But what I will say on a very, very high level, very oversimplified level, is that the 100 Years' War is a dynastic question of who has the better right to the throne of France, the Plantagenet kings of England or the Valois kings of France. And by the time we get to the reign of Henry V, this conflict has been ongoing, albeit very much off and on, for the better part of 8 decades. And Henry V comes to the throne of England and says, I'm the person who's going to settle the question once and for all. I am going to claim the throne of France in fact as well as in name. And you know what? He kind of does. Or at least he comes about as close as any Plantagenet monarch ever does. So Henry V invades France from England. It fights a number of successful battles, of which undoubtedly the most famous is the great victory at Agincourt. And by 1420, brings the French to the bargaining table, or at least what we'll say is a faction of the French royal family. And the result is what becomes known as the Treaty of Troyes. And I'm sorry in advance to all of our Francophone listeners and viewers. I'm probably going to wildly mispronounce a lot of French things. I'm sorry. Muzzy commercials did not work on me in my childhood. Anyway, so the Treaty of Troyes in 1420 says, Charles VI of France, who is the mentally incapacitated King of France, he will remain King of France for the rest of his life. But when he dies, the throne will not pass to his son Charles, the Dauphin. It will pass to Henry V and his heirs forever. And this is going to be sealed by a marriage between Henry V and Charles VI's daughter, Catherine. This is it! He's done it! He's won! Henry V has been acknowledged by a faction of the French royal family as the rightful heir to the throne of France. And so Henry does, in fact, marry Catherine, and they do, in fact, have a son together, baby Henry. Henry V never meets his son, though, because he continues to campaign in France. And although everything seems like it's going great for him, he's on top of the world, this is precisely the moment when Henry V dies. Of a really awful case of dysentery. And so baby Henry, who is 9 months old, now becomes King of England. And if that sounds wildly unstable to you, things get even worse. Because 1 month later, Charles VI dies as well. Meaning that baby Henry, who I cannot stress enough is 10 months old, is now King of England and King of France. And if that sounds chaotic and problematic and destined to fail, well, gosh darn it, you're right. Because not only is the Regency a very stressful, very chaotic, very unstable period in English history, but also the new King of France, Charles VII, is not at all shy about saying that he is the rightful king, and with the help of one Joan of Arc is gonna make good on that claim. But all of this might have been one thing if Henry VI had grown up to be a carbon copy of his dad. Unfortunately, what history history realizes and what his contemporaries realize is that while Henry VI looks like his dad, and while Henry VI is very pious like his dad, he's not a warrior. In fact, Henry VI hates war. He's offended by it. He's ashamed of it. He thinks it is morally wrong to spill the blood of other Christians. And so he's going to do what he thinks is necessary to get peace in this conflict. How it works out for him, well, those are some specific parallels that we'll get to as we continue to talk about Baelor.
That is your real-world interlude, folks. Loved that. Always fun to relate things to real history. George, not unlikely to have been inspired by some of that, in addition to the prior Jesus parallels, of course. Now, let's talk about Baelor's reign, the beginning of it. We've led up to it, we've built up to it, but let's get to the start here. Baelor comes to the throne in 160 AC after Daeron is assassinated under the peace banner in Dorne. It's, of course, very shocking. It was very unlikely, very unexpected. We don't know how quickly news traveled to King's Landing or who sent the message. Would have been pretty chaotic, right? A king killed at a parley, the Dragon Knight captured. I mean, what to do, right? But the Dornish didn't kill everyone. The king surely traveled with maesters, and those maesters would have had ravens. So most likely the highest ranking survivor took charge. We don't know who that was, but it's probably something like that, and would have directed the maesters, because they probably survived, at least one of them, or at least someone who knew how to take a bird out of a cage and stick a message to its claw. That would have probably been doable by somebody. Somehow that happened. The raven gets back to King's Landing. However news got there, whatever the circumstances were, it would have been quite the shock.
News soon reached King's Landing of King Daeron's death and the rout of his remaining forces. The outrage that followed was swiftly directed at the Dornish hostages. At the command of the king's hand, Prince Viserys, they were thrown into the dungeons to await hanging. The Hand's eldest son, Prince Aegon, even delivered the Dornish girl he had made his paramour to his father to await execution. The young dragon had never married nor fathered children. Accordingly, upon his death, the Iron Throne passed to his brother Baelor, a youth of 10 and 7.
No, absolutely. Agreed on the shocking nature of this news. Now, of course, because we don't have Blood and Fire and we don't have details on this period, we don't know exactly how Baelor reacted. And we're probably not going to ever be in his head in the way we would in, say, a novel or novella to really get a true sense of those thoughts and feelings. But what I think we can do is analyze how he reacted and what that may tell us about how he was thinking and feeling. And what I think is important to emphasize here is that Baelor reacts immediately, boldly, and in the eyes of his contemporaries, very controversially on the news of his brother's assassination. Remember, Baelor is only 17. That's still young, even by Westerosi standards, to take power. And Baelor, although he was heir presumptive during his brother's reign, it's not to say that he was ever formally trained with the eye that he would absolutely take power one day. And so for someone in Baelor's position, it may have been very easy to be overwhelmed or scared or anxious about this. Baelor goes from yesterday he was a mere prince of the royal dynasty with at best a theoretical right to the throne, to today he's lord of the Seven Kingdoms with the fates of millions of Westerosi subjects suddenly put on his shoulders. And yet, Baelor does not hesitate even remotely. As soon as he gets this news, he says exactly what he wants in terms of ending the war, in terms of negotiating a peace, in terms of what he's going to do with these hostages. And he makes it very clear he expects this to be done.
And it's probably a big surprise, not just to, well, most people, but perhaps most of all to his uncle Viserys, who was probably expecting him to defer a little bit. Maybe not, because Daeron didn't defer. Daeron was like, yeah, I'm king even though I'm not 16 yet. We're doing what I say. And everybody's like, okay. He had that kind of charisma, that kind of presence. They listened to him. Maybe Baelor did too, but I think there's a strong chance a lot of people would have expected him to maybe come along a little slowly, get up to speed, take the advice of senior counsel. This is a situation of war. It's a delicate situation. But he immediately just goes against Viserys. Viserys throws all these people in jail, schedules their executions, because that's what you do with hostages when the peace is violated. They were shocked. They were angry. Everyone was mad. They wanted vengeance. But Baelor, rather than giving in, rather than saying, okay, we'll slowly bring this back around, no, he immediately says, no, the violence ends now. And what courage that must have taken. He must have had just about everybody against him, right? Like, it probably was very few people on his side, maybe. I mean, there's had to be a few people on his side, as we said, some of the earlier court allies we mentioned, but they must have been in the extreme minority, huh?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you're right on the money there when you point out how shocking this probably was to Viserys, because I think you're absolutely right. Viserys had been Hand of the King, or de facto Hand of the King, I think, for probably the better part of 20 years, if not longer. He was very experienced in ruling the government, and while Daeron was away in Dorne, had probably pretty much acted as king in all but name in King's Landing. So I could very much see where, when he gets the news of Daeron's assassination, the news that Baelor is now king, Viserys may have immediately expected that Baelor would simply be, if not quite a puppet, someone who would be very easily led by him, someone that he could tell what to do, because of course, Prince Viserys is experienced. He knows how the government works. He knows how statesmanship works. And yet, what he's facing is this teenage nephew who has never so much, so far as we know, held any kind of governmental or court position, saying, "Oh no, uncle, you work for me. I don't care what you think my brother would have done. I don't care what you think we should do. I'm the king. I tell you what to do. It's your job as Hand to execute my authority, not for you to exercise your own." And so I think that you're absolutely right to say that Baelor has this real conviction, has this real sense of bravery and self-assurance that, I mentioned this before and I'll say it again, I think really parallels him with Daeron. Baelor is not afraid to not only commit to this absolute peace, but in doing so, to go against the public policies of both his late brother, the king, and his uncle, this experienced Hand. He's not afraid to face down outrage at court in King's Landing because he's doing what he believes is right. And he's saying, I really don't care if you think we should execute the hostages, because I do not believe we should. And because I am king, I will dictate terms to you. I think it's also worth considering just how much Baelor was sort of, I don't want to say divinely inspired here, but perhaps in his own mind, divinely inspired here. In other words, thinking about this in a religious context. I mentioned this when we talked about, did Baelor oppose his brother's war during his brother's lifetime? And, I mentioned Baelor may have been reacting in a very pious way, saying that this war is wrong on a religious level. And so for Baelor, is it possible that when he gets the news of his brother's death, he's seeing this as effectively part of the Seven's plan, that his brother made this impious war in Dorne. He's making war on the faithful when he shouldn't be. So the gods have struck him down for his impiety. And now they are raising up Baelor as their hero, as their champion. It is Baelor that they are putting the crown on his brow and saying, you need to do our will here. It's very possible, I think, that Baelor is seeing it in that way, and that's what makes him, in part, so confident in acting. If he believes, the gods have selected me for this, the gods have reached out to me, I am the one who will do their will. I think that's very possible.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it fits in with several things we've said throughout this episode. Let me address those. For example, you pointed out that perhaps the biggest influence on Baelor was Jaehaerys, which seems easy to agree with, and here's an extra bit of evidence for that. Jaehaerys also took an extreme hardline towards peace at a time when the realm was kind of fractured, and he said, no, I'm going to take this enemy of mine, this guy who was my bitterest foe, the foe of my dynasty, and make him one of my Kingsguard. That was a very dramatic maneuver that surprised and upset and made some people a little wary. They're like, is this a good idea? This guy might just stab you in the back. But of course, it worked quite well. It was a great move. This commitment to peace was very positive and had the desired effect. So Baelor could also look back on history and say, hey, this has worked before. Being dramatically peaceful in the face of war, it has historical precedent. It's not just, I'm a peacenik and I will do everything I can to make peace. No, there's some intelligence behind this. You can see the plan, you can see the cunning, you can see the evidence from his ancestor. And that's a really important thing as well. And yeah, it's difficult to go against everyone when they're shouting you down, going against the grain like that. That does take a lot of courage. And that's something you also pointed out early on, that this is not a weak man. This is not somebody that is easily influenced. His main influence comes from the gods, that's tricky because that's his interpretation of what he feels and what he thinks. And it goes to what I was saying about him drinking his own Kool-Aid, the Kool-Aid that he made himself. He's saying, well, I'm the king now. The gods wanted me to be king. That must mean they want me to be the person I've been all along. That must mean they want the things that I bring to the table to happen in the realm. So yeah, it is very self-fulfilling, and it must give him just ultimately supreme confidence in what he's doing. I think there would be very little hesitation, very little, am I doing this wrong? Should I? Very little doubt. I think maybe more so than just about any Targaryen king, if not as much as any Targaryen king. Aegon the Conqueror had this kind of confidence. It's hard to compare the two because it's a different sort of confidence, but it was a belief in what he was doing that was just completely unshakable. And Baelor had that in a way that's in a package, a character who's packaged very differently than these other Targaryens, but it's that same determination, that same confidence in himself. And that's something that we will see in greater detail when he is fully empowered. We have just scratched the surface of his reign. We're concluding our episode today with the start of his reign. Part 2 will be all about his full reign, the time when he's invested with power, and it really does follow an interesting pattern, right? He's got all these ideas about peace, but it starts to devolve a bit and get weird, and well, it's going to be a lot of fun, isn't it, Nina?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you think I have things to say about Baelor now, just wait until we get to Baelor's reign, because I will have even more to say. Yeah,
this episode I think was really fun. I had a lot of fun making it, but I do think the second part is the payoff. The first part, this is the setup. This is the early part of this man's life, his development, his upbringing. It's the book that sets up all the action that comes afterwards. Because yeah, his reign was just so wild and weird, and even though we don't know so much about it, the stuff we do know is just, there's so many fun rabbit holes. I can't wait to get to it, y'all. The walk, the book burning, the strange beliefs about the North, and this is the guy that made an 8-year-old the High Septon. I mean, tried to replace the ravens with doves. I mean, yeah, he was definitely not all there, but that's part of what makes him so interesting, right? Like, this guy had all in some ways he was like none of the other Targaryens, but in some ways he was a lot like, he was the most Targaryen of them all in other ways. So yeah, can't wait to get to that for y'all. But for now, we'll say goodbye. Thanks again so much to Nina for being here. She'll be back for part 2. Let's remind everybody, you are active at goodqueenally.tumblr.com. That's ALY in alley. And what's the latest question you've got there? I usually like to tell everybody the latest question you've received, but why don't you do that for us this time since you're here?
You're putting me on the spot, Aziz. Let me think about this. I was answering one recently about Edric Storm, about what might have been his future of that, answering questions about Davos's reward from Stannis. I always have essay ideas, that's really hard to say, essay ideas that are percolating in the back of my head that are probably half written in some Google Doc somewhere. So maybe in 5 years I'll eventually finish one. And just always free to answer questions whenever I get to them about any variety of topics, including but not limited to the Accursed Kings.
Of course, yeah, you are the world's foremost expert on the Accursed Kings, I must say.
I'm not setting that up as foreshadowing or anything. It's fine.
So yes, you can feel free to submit questions to Nina at goodqueenally.tumblr.com if you have something in mind. We mentioned some episodes throughout this one that are relevant. Of course, the Daeron I, the Young Dragon episode, very relevant. We talked about that quite a bit off and on. If you want to deep dive into him and his full reign, I recommend that episode. Also, Aemon the Dragon Knight, we did 2 episodes on him, someone who was absolutely a big influence on Baelor and would continue to be. We'll talk about that more in Baelor Part 2. Thank you again to everyone who supports us on Patreon. If you support us on Spotify, we appreciate that as well. Those are both the 2 places to support us. You can also go to our website, historyofwesteros.com, where you can find a number of other ways to support the show and to find links to our other content, our episode searcher, things like that. Thanks again to Joey and Jesse for our music, to Michael Klarfeld for the video intro, and to Ashea for all the production stuff and for having so many arms. This episode covered Baelor's early life before he became king. We'll have another episode dedicated to his life as king, and a 3rd episode where we focus on his death and long-lasting legacy. And here's some shout-outs to our Patreon supporters. Our Hand of the King is a baseborn manjack, literally just a drunken spearman. Gods help us. Lord Giuliano of House U is Hand of Queen Ashea, known as the Omni Knight. Lord Jim, the fortuitous of Wars and Politics of Ice and Fire blog, is Warden of the West. Lord George Stormsville the Cunning is Lord of the Chiliad and Warden of the East. Kabeth the Unfrozen is Lord of the Bricks and Castle Crimson Light, Defender of the Old Gods and Warden of the North. Lord Donorus Pular is Head of House Pular, Lord of Amora and Warden of the South. Jenny the Just is captain of the ghost ship Liberty, which vanished in the Shivering Sea over a century ago, but has recently been sighted near Volantis, if the tales can be believed. King Beyond the Wall, Sidney Jesse, is the Fallborn, Lord of Blue Spring and the Haunted Forest. He wields a dagger of dragon glass and the Valyrian steel blade Red Frost. He really does not understand the concept of a king who deals no violence at all, but he's curious. Sea Lord Sean Gallagher is the Titan's Binger, owner of 9 Valyrian steel ears. The Bastard of the Bay of Seals is a friend of the Night's Watch, commanding a ship made entirely of weirwood. Our White Walker patrons include Alexander Greyblood is first of the first men now crowned in ice, called Silence Bringer, Woodblinder, and the Snow of Night, wielder of the ice-forged greatsword Pale Frost. Nevada Pike is fourth of Frost, Frost Kraken, drowned in ice, commander of cats and krakens. Our small council includes Lord Taylor of House Lineberry, Strength of Stone, Will of Iron, Master of Coin. Lord Chris B. of House Baelish, always keep your foes confused, Master of Whispers. Drowned Dan, Lord of House Windsor, Master of Karate, Friendship for Everyone, and Ships. Lord Goodkill McGee, ruler of Castle Over Yonder, Master of Laws. And Grand Maester Scotty. Our lords and ladies in their castles include Lady Direliz of Castle Naki, the Alpha Patron. Lord Dan of the Red Mountains and Castle Great Bell, Breaker of the Second Stone. Gregor the Toasty, Lord of the Breadfort. Ashlyn Winter, the Hawk's Eye, Lady of Castle Skyfall. The Lord of the Halls of Castle Hillcrest, wielder of the Valyrian steel machete Everglazed. Lord Bemmy Snugglebunny, guardian ranger of the hidden 100-acre weirwood, dual wielder of Valyrian short swords Glorious Morning and Little Light Wise. Sharpshooter of the weirwood and ironwood laminated longbow Todd Von Oben. When you fear things cannot get worse, Snugglebunny enters the fray. The Bastard of the Wolfswood, first forester of the Old Gods, sworn to House Ironwerewood, listen for the silence. Casey Stark of House Acres. Peter Rivers, the Pale Dragon and heir to Bloodraven. Lady Mora of House Stark, Archmistress of Apothecaries and Woods Witch. Her castle features weirwood doors with painted moons. Lena Snow, the Twilight Star, bastard daughter of Dane, wife of the Trickster and Lady of Castle Rivia. Jason Stark, second son of the North, wielder of the Valyrian steel sword Bloodbath, Lord of Castle Whitewood. The chill is real. Suck-ass Gamer, master of soap and clay. Aminda Pinkwolf, lady and ruler of Castle Whitefast. The ice emboldens. Lord Benjen of House Hornwood. Lady Rebecca Stark of Castle Aurora, wielder of a weirwood bow with Valyrian steel-tipped arrows and friend of Short Round the Direwolf. Aurelian Matthias Resius, Lord of House Aurelian, ruler of Domus Aurelianus and the Valley of Tanasi, wielder of Sol Invictus, a blade, perhaps, of Valyrian steel. Keeper of the largest collection of books outside the Citadel. We restore the world. Lord Garen of Devil's Hand Keep. Lady Jane of House Celtigar, wielder of the Valyrian steel axe Painkiller. Lord Darian the Daring, wielder of the Valyrian steel sword Wisdom, Lord of House Hollingsworth and the Hollyhold of Dorne. Power in knowledge. Sir Garrett Gabehart, Lord of the Bluegrass. Gabe the Jade Blade, whose foes are skewered and grilled. Lady Maria of House Hightree, Lady of the Castle Fair Oak on the Crooked Lake, ever watchful. Queen's High Council includes Grand Maester Rennie, whose rod and ring and mask are quartz crystal, wielder of the Valyrian steel pen, fire, and ink. The Purple Lord Leo and Nancy, Master of Whisperers. Lady Wolfbird, Mistress of the Eastern Rivers, Gatekeeper of the Northern Skies, Daughter of the Silver Sea, and Master of Coin. Devorlin Blackwood, maker of the Frozen Fury Muscle Balm, eucalyptus and mint leaves, washed with Dornish peppers and sealed by fire ants, Master of Laws. Lady Jane of Driftmark, Guardian of Dragonstone, the Circling Flame Burns, Master of Ships. Lady Sonia of Sunspear, Keeper of the Martell Menagerie, Master of Castle Tormira Topanga, Tame and Keep Well, Master of Whispers. Our Kingsguard includes Lord Commander Jackson, Sir Dean the White, Knight of the Black Star, Sir Bateman, the Dark Knight, Lady Ani, Bringer of Winter's Warning, Watcher in the Werewood, Bearer of the Wrist Wolves, Lord Jonathan of House Tanner, Lord Raydetto of House Avocado, Protector of the Royal Kitchens, Green in the Morning, Dark by Evening. Our Queensguard includes Lord Captain Commander Haema Helminth, the Sellsword Sentinel, James the Green, Lord of the Meadows, Keeper of the Trial of Grasses, Amber the Adamant, the Knight of the Mist and Mother of Squids, the Wintry Wolverine, We Finish What You Begin, Nora Neko, Archmaester Vena, whose ring, rod, and mask are made of steel, not pudding, Laura Boros, the Lady of Infinity. Our Beard Guard includes Lord Commander George the Golden, Lady Rita of the Coppermane, the Unbound, Dance the Fervor, Sir Jeff, Warden of the AC, wielder of Triad, the multifaceted beard of platinum, red, and brown, Stay Frosty, Bloody Ben Blackwood, Big Brian Blackwood, Davin Mack, Knight of the Reeds, the Bog Knight. And the History of Westeros Night's Watch, led by Lord Commander Richard the Ligerheart, wielder of Barry's Anklebreaker, a flail with blue and silver Valyrian steel spikes. Go Blue! And First Builder Maegor Snow, aka Maegor the Cool, the fire and the snow. First Ranger Liam, aka Sir Waiting on a Nickname. And First Steward Sir Zack of House Wild, Lord Shredder of the Spiral, wielder of the Valyrian steel axe Grail. And until next time, Valar reread us.